An EIS does not happen in a vacuum. Most EISs will require consultation with one or more federal agencies during the development of an EIS. These are required to ensure that the proposed action will be consistent with the requirements of other major federal legislation. In addition to following and adhering to the CEQ regulations and the consultations, there are many key pieces of legislation that form the legal context for development of the EIS. Within completed EISs, you will find a list and/or discussion of these pieces of legislation that have guided development of the EIS. Let's take a closer look at these topics. Section 1502.25 of the CEQ regulations lists 3 acts of Congress that the lead agency must consider when preparing an EIS. These are the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Coordination is accomplished by preparing environmental impact analyses. Here are some more details. The Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, FWCA, as amended in 1964, was enacted to protect fish and wildlife when federal actions result in the control or modification of a natural stream or body of water. The statute requires federal agencies to take into consideration the effect that water-related projects would have on fish and wildlife resources, to take action to prevent loss or damage to these resources, and to provide for the development and improvement of these resources. In order to know if consultation under FWCA is required, the agency preparing the EIS must determine if the proposed activity results in the control or modification of a body of water. In most instances, if there's any impact to water, or a reasonable chance there will be, a consultation will be requested. The last thing agencies want to do is complete an EIS and then find out they did not request consultation with a cooperating agency. In the case of the FWCA, if the consulting agency determines that a proposed action will have impacts, the agency preparing the EIS must develop appropriate mitigation to offset what the consulting agency says are the impacts to fish and wildlife resources. As you might imagine, this can be a contentious issue if the 2 agencies do not agree on the impacts or the proposed mitigation. When you first hear or read about the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, it seems odd that historic resources are a major consideration in an EIS. The NHPA was passed primarily to acknowledge the importance of protecting our nation's heritage from rampant federal development. It was the triumph of more than a century of struggle by a grassroots movement of committed preservationists. Because compliance requires review of the project site, once NEPA was created, the responsibility for assessing and protecting historic resources was included in NEPA reviews. Some key elements of the Act include setting federal policy for preserving our nation's heritage, establishing federal, state, and federal tribal partnerships, establishing the National Register of Historic Places and National Historic Landmarks, and others seen in this slide. Similar to the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, agencies preparing an EIS will err on the side of caution and conduct a cultural resources survey or, at a minimum, ask the State Government Historic Preservation Office, called SHPO, to search their records and advise if there are any potentially significant historic resources. States are required to have a depository of this information and will provide such report when it is required. Consultation under the ESA follows a similar process as we saw in the FWCA. The statute requires federal agencies to take into consideration the effect a project will have on threatened or endangered species, or, if it's present, designated critical habitat for these species. If the consulting agency concludes that the proposed action will have adverse impacts, then the agency preparing the EIS, hopefully working in cooperation with the consulting agency, will devise a plan to avoid, minimize, or mitigate for these impacts. Again, there is a chance the agencies may not see eye to eye on how the problems should be resolved. Section 1502.25 also mentions, in what almost sounds like a comment in passing, that an EIS must also consider other environmental review laws and executive orders. Actually, the list of these other laws and executive orders is likely to be lengthy. In this slide, we've listed about half of the laws and executive orders that had to be considered in the EIS proposing the deepening of Charleston Harbor. The point here is not to read the list, but to appreciate the length of the list and the level of detail needed to make sure the EIS is in compliance. The second part of 1502.25 makes an important distinction about an EIS. Issuance of an EIS does not authorize the agency that prepared the EIS to begin work on the project. In simple terms, an EIS is not a permit. The agency that will be overseeing or doing the work must still obtain all required federal permits, licenses, and other entitlements necessary to authorize the work. In closing, this lesson brings to light the multitude of acts, regulations, and executive orders an agency must consider when preparing an EIS. Consultation with other federal agencies is often needed to address historic resources and fish and wildlife, with special emphasis on federally listed species. And even with the completion of an EIS, any permits required to conduct the project must also be obtained before work can begin.